Have you ever wondered what happens when the person everyone ignores finally decides they've had enough? What happens when the quietest voice in the room becomes the only one that matters? We often mistake silence for weakness and overlook the strength brewing just beneath the surface. We believe that power is loud, that it announces itself with grand gestures and booming declarations. But sometimes, the most devastating force, the most profound act of rebellion, is delivered in a single, perfectly aimed whisper. This is a story about a woman who is seen as nothing more than an accessory, a beautiful, silent fixture in her husband's magnificent life. He thought her silence was a cage he had built. He was about to find out it was a fortress, and he had just handed her the key. It all happened at her brother's wedding, a day that was supposed to be about celebrating a new beginning, but for her, it would become the explosive end of an old one. It was a day of champagne, white roses, and brutal public humiliation. But it was also the day a single, whispered truth would prove more powerful than 1,000 shouted lies, and a man who believed he was a king would be brought to his knees by the queen he never saw coming. The wedding of her younger brother, Liam, was a masterpiece of classic elegance, a scene plucked from a high-fashion magazine. Held in the sprawling gardens of a historic country manor, the air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive perfume. Sunlight, golden and forgiving, filtered through the ancient oak trees, dappling the white linen tablecloths and catching the sparkle of crystal glasses. Ilara had helped Liam's fiancée, Chloe, plan every detail, pouring her own suppressed creativity into the floral arrangements and the delicate, handwritten place cards. She found a quiet solace in creating beauty for others, a temporary distraction from the carefully concealed ugliness of her own life. Her husband, Marcus, stood beside her, a portrait of success and charm. To the world, he was a titan of industry, a man who had built a tech empire from the ground up. He was handsome, charismatic, and exuded an aura of effortless control. He held her hand, but his touch was less an act of affection and more a gesture of ownership, a subtle reminder to everyone that she, too, was one of his prized possessions. Ilara smiled, a practiced, perfect curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Inside, a familiar dread coiled in her stomach. Weddings always did this to her. They were poignant reminders of her own, a decade ago, a day that had been filled with genuine hope, before the slow, insidious rot of Marcus's ambition had hollowed out their marriage, leaving only a gilded, empty shell. She watched Liam and Chloe at the head table, their faces glowing with a pure, unadulterated joy that felt like a foreign language to her now. Liam caught her eye and gave her a wide, heartfelt grin, a look that said, "Can you believe it?" She felt a pang in her chest, a mix of love for him and a deep, aching grief for what she had lost, or perhaps for what she had never truly had. Marcus leaned in, his voice a low murmur against her ear, meant only for her. "Your brother looks happy. It's amazing what a little money can do for a man's prospects." The comment was typical Marcus, cynical, dismissive, and designed to subtly diminish her family, to remind her that he was the source of all the good things in her life. She didn't respond, instead taking a slow sip of her champagne, the bubbles fizzing on her tongue, a fleeting sensation in a life that had become numb. She could feel the weight of his expectations, the silent command to play her part, the adoring, supportive wife. For years, she had done it flawlessly. She hosted his soulless dinner parties, laughed at his cruel jokes, and absorbed his private frustrations and casual cruelties like a sponge. She had become an expert at pretending, a virtuoso of the silent smile. But lately, the pretense was growing heavier, the silence more suffocating. She had discovered things that had started as a flicker of suspicion and had grown into a raging fire of certainty, a truth she kept locked away in the most fortified part of her heart. The sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. The fairy lights strung between the trees flickered on, casting a magical glow over the reception. The formal dinner had concluded, and the air buzzed with laughter and the clinking of glasses as the best man delivered a heartfelt, humorous speech. Ilara felt a moment of peace, watching her brother's genuine happiness. This was what mattered. This pure, untainted love. But her peace was short-lived. As the best man sat down to thunderous applause, Marcus pushed his chair back and stood up. He hadn't been scheduled to speak. Liam had asked him, out of courtesy, but Marcus had declined with a dismissive wave of his hand weeks ago, claiming he was too busy to prepare anything. Ilara's heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She knew that look in his eye. It was a look of spontaneous arrogance, a sudden need to command the spotlight, and it never ended well for her. "Marcus, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice tight with alarm. He glanced down at her, his smile a condescending smirk. "Relax, darling. I just feel inspired. It's not every day your brother-in-law gets married. I should say a few words." He adjusted his perfectly tailored suit jacket and strode confidently toward the microphone, picking it up from the stand with the ease of a man who believed every stage belonged to him. A hush fell over the guests as they saw the prominent Marcus Thorne take the floor. Ilara felt 100 pairs of eyes turn toward her, and she forced her smile to remain in place, a fragile mask threatening to crack. She remembered a similar moment years ago at a company awards dinner. He had won a major accolade and, in his acceptance speech, had jokingly thanked her for being so undemanding that it allowed him to focus entirely on his work, because she had no pesky career of her own to distract him. The laughter from his colleagues had felt like stones being thrown at her. She had been a promising architect before she met him, a detail he conveniently omitted, a dream she had set aside when he'd insisted her support for his career was more important. Now, as he tapped the microphone, a smug sense of power radiating from him, she knew he was about to do it again. She could see it in the way he stood, in the predatory gleam in his eyes. He was going to use her brother's beautiful day as another stage for his casual cruelty, another opportunity to reinforce his dominance and her insignificance. "Liam. Chloe." Marcus began, his voice booming through the speakers, rich and charismatic. "What a beautiful day. A testament to love, to new beginnings." He raised his glass, and the guests murmured in appreciation. He was a master of the opening act, drawing everyone in with his charm. He shared a genuinely funny story about meeting Liam for the first time, casting himself as the wise, older brother figure. Liam smiled, still blissfully unaware of the turn this speech was about to take. Ilara watched, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. She knew the pivot was coming. And then it came. "Seeing these two so in love, it reminds me of my own marriage," Marcus continued, turning his gaze to lock onto Ilara's. The warmth in his voice was gone, replaced by a saccharine, patronizing tone. "My lovely Ilara. She's taught me so much." He paused for effect. "She's taught me that you don't need a fancy degree or a high-powered career to be happy. Sometimes, all a woman needs is a good man to take care of her." A few scattered, uncertain chuckles rippled through the crowd. Liam's smile faltered. He glanced from Marcus to Ilara, a flicker of concern in his eyes. But Marcus was just getting started. "People ask me, Marcus, what's the secret to your success? And I always tell them the secret is having a wife who knows her place. Someone who keeps the home fires burning, who doesn't trouble her pretty little head with things like stock options or board meetings." He winked, as if sharing a delightful secret. "She's the picture of simplicity, my Ilara. Her biggest ambition when I met her was to plan the perfect dinner party. And I have to say, darling," he said, looking directly at her, "you do throw a magnificent dinner party. It's a real talent." The words were daggers wrapped in velvet. He was painting her as a simpleton, a domestic accessory, erasing every trace of the intelligent, capable woman she had once been. The humiliation was a physical sensation, a hot wave that washed over her, from her scalp to the soles of her feet. The guests' faces were a blur of pity and discomfort. They weren't laughing anymore. The air was thick with a collective cringe. He was no longer a charming speaker. He was a bully on a stage. He raised his glass one last time. "So, let's toast not just to Liam and Chloe, but to all the supportive wives out there. The quiet ones. The ones who understand that behind every great man, is a woman who knows when to stay in the background. To Alara. The applause was sparse, hesitant, and died out almost as soon as it began. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with the awkwardness of 100 people who had just witnessed an act of breathtaking cruelty. Marcus, seemingly oblivious or perhaps reveling in the discomfort he had caused, walked back to the table with a triumphant swagger. He sat down, placing the microphone on the table with a definitive thud. He leaned toward Alara, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey and self-satisfaction. "Smile," he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss that no one else could hear. "They're all looking at you. Don't embarrass me by crying, that was it." That was the final crack in the dam of her composure, the final straw on a decade of burdens. For years, she had absorbed his insults, swallowed his condescension, and kept his secrets, all under the guise of maintaining their marriage, of keeping the peace. She had convinced herself that her silence was a form of strength, a dignified endurance. But in that moment, under the pitying gaze of her friends and family on what should have been one of the happiest days of her brother's life, she realized her silence was not strength. It was complicity. It was a permission slip he had used again and again. The hot flush of shame that had consumed her moments before receded, replaced by an icy, diamond-hard clarity. The hurt was still there, a deep, aching wound, but something new was crystallizing around it, resolve. A cold, furious, and absolute resolve. She looked past Marcus's smug face and met the eyes of her brother, Liam. He wasn't looking at Marcus with anger. Not yet. He was looking at her, his expression a mixture of profound worry, heartbreak, and a fierce, protective love that she hadn't seen directed at her in years. In his eyes, she wasn't the simple, ambitionless woman Marcus had just described. She was his big sister, the one who had taught him how to read, who had defended him from bullies in the schoolyard, the one he loved. That look was all the fuel she needed. It was a reminder of who she was before Marcus, before the hollowing out began. The years of quiet observation, of piecing together the fragments of his lies, of gathering the evidence she had never intended to use, all coalesced into a single, powerful weapon. He thought her a fool. He thought her ignorant. He had no idea what she knew. He had no idea that for the last 6 months, she had been living with a secret that could dismantle his entire world. And he had just given her the perfect reason to use it. With a calmness that felt utterly alien and yet deeply, primally her own, Alara placed her napkin on the table. She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. The scraping of the chair legs on the polished floor was the only sound in the sudden, expectant hush that had fallen over the surrounding tables. Everyone had seen the humiliation. Now, they were watching for the reaction. They expected tears. They expected a quiet retreat. They did not expect this. Marcus looked up, his expression shifting from smugness to irritation. "What are you doing?" "I told you not to make a scene," he hissed, his voice a low, threatening growl. "Sit down, Alara." She didn't even glance at him. She smoothed the front of her silk dress, her gaze fixed on a point across the room. She felt a strange lightness, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The prying eyes of the guests no longer felt like a source of shame, they felt like witnesses. And she was ready to give them a testimony. She began to walk. Not toward the exit, not toward her brother, but directly toward the center of the room, her path taking her straight back toward her husband. Each step was a silent declaration. The soft click of her heels on the floor echoed in the cavernous silence. It was a long walk, perhaps only 20 feet, but it felt like a mile. In that short journey, a decade of her life flashed through her mind. Not the good parts, but the moments of quiet erosion. The suggestions that she quit her job. The jokes about her intellect in front of their friends. The times he'd taken credit for her ideas. The nights he didn't come home, offering flimsy excuses she was meant to accept without question. And then, the more recent memories. The late-night hushed phone calls he thought she was sleeping through. The credit card statements for gifts she never received, for hotel rooms in their own city. The hiring of the private investigator, an act that had felt like a betrayal of her own vows, but had become an act of self-preservation. She remembered the investigator's report, sitting in a locked drawer in her desk. The photographs, the text messages, and the name. Sarah, a junior intern at his company. A girl barely out of college. A girl who is now, according to the final, devastating report, 16 weeks pregnant. The world had tilted on its axis when she read that. But she had held it in, biding her time, unsure of what to do with such a cataclysmic truth. Now she knew. Her steps became firmer, her posture straighter. She was no longer walking through a wedding reception. She was marching toward her own liberation. She reached the table and stopped, standing over her husband. Marcus was still seated, forced to look up at her. The irritation on his face was now mixed with a sliver of confusion. He was a man who was never defied, and he couldn't comprehend what was happening. His world was ordered, controlled, and she was a variable he had always been able to solve. He opened his mouth to order her to sit down again, but he never got the chance. Ilara leaned down, a gesture of seeming intimacy that mirrored the way he had leaned in to whisper his own cruelties. To anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like a wife murmuring a private word to her husband, a quiet reconciliation. Her hair fell forward, creating a curtain around them, a private space in the middle of a very public room. Her lips were almost touching his ear. The scent of her perfume, a fragrance he had bought her, filled his senses. And then she spoke. Her voice was not angry, not shaking, not loud. It was a whisper. It was calm, precise, and utterly lethal. "I know about Sarah," she breathed, the words a soft puff of air against his skin. Marcus's body went rigid. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but she felt it. She continued, her voice never wavering from its quiet, devastating cadence. "I know she works in marketing. I know you've been seeing her for 8 months," she paused, letting the words sink in, letting him absorb the shock of her knowledge. His breath hitched. She could feel the sudden, frantic thumping of his heart through the back of his chair. And then she delivered the final, world-shattering blow. "And I know she's 16 weeks pregnant, Marcus. I also know all about the termination you tried to force on her. The appointment she missed last Tuesday because she decided she's going to keep your baby." She pulled back slowly, her face a mask of serene composure. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds to detonate a decade of lies. She watched as every drop of color drained from Marcus's face. His skin turned a waxy, sickly gray. His smug, arrogant mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated, crumbling away to reveal the terrified, pathetic man underneath. His eyes, which moments ago had been filled with cruel amusement, were now wide with pure, unadulterated panic. His jaw hung slack, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. He was utterly, completely, and irrevocably broken. Marcus stared at her, his mind struggling to process the information. It wasn't just that she knew. It was how she knew. The precision of her words, the name, the number of weeks, the missed appointment, was a testament to a level of knowledge he had never imagined her capable of acquiring. In his mind, she was simple, passive, unobservant. The realization that she had been moving in the shadows of his life, silently gathering the facts of his betrayal, was a shock more profound than the exposure itself. He felt the room tilt, the cheerful music and distant laughter fading into a dull roar in his ears. He tried to form a word, a denial, a threat, but his throat had closed up. All he could manage was a dry, rasping sound. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her, and the woman he saw was a terrifying stranger. Her eyes were not filled with the tears he expected, but with a cold, clear strength he had never seen before. There was no hatred in her gaze, no rage, just a calm, quiet finality. It was the look of a judge who had already passed sentence. Without another word, Ilara straightened to her full height. She turned her back on him, a simple, elegant movement that was the most profound act of dismissal he had ever experienced. She left him there, a statue of ruin in his expensive suit, exposed under the warm glow of the fairy lights, his carefully constructed universe having been obliterated by a whisper. The silence at their table had become a vacuum, drawing the attention of those nearby. Liam, who had been watching the entire exchange with a furrowed brow, saw the complete transformation of Marcus's demeanor. He saw the confident bully collapse into a hollowed-out shell of a man, and he saw the new, unshakable strength in his sister's posture as she turned away. He knew, with absolute certainty, that something fundamental had just shifted. He pushed his chair back and started to move toward them, his protective instincts now fully ablaze. The party was no longer a concern. His only concern was his sister. He needed to know what had just happened. He needed to know what that monster had done now and what she, in turn, had done to him. The music swelled, a cheerful pop song about summer love, creating a surreal, discordant soundtrack to the silent, personal apocalypse unfolding at Table 7. Liam reached the table just as Alara was taking her first step away from it. He gently put a hand on her arm, his touch warm and questioning. "Alara? Are you okay?" "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low and urgent, meant only for her. He looked from his sister's calm, composed face to the ashen, shattered wreck that was her husband, and back again. The contrast was staggering. For the first time in a very long time, Alara's smile was not a performance. It was small, but it was real, and it reached her clear, steady eyes. A profound sense of relief washed over her. She had done it. She had spoken her truth, not for an audience, not for revenge, but for herself. And she was free. "I've never been better," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She gave her brother's hand a reassuring squeeze. "I'm just going to get some fresh air. Don't let me ruin your night. It's a beautiful wedding, Liam. You and Chloe deserve all the happiness in the world." With that, she turned and walked away, not in a rush, but with the unhurried grace of someone who had nowhere to run to because she was finally standing on her own ground. She walked toward the large French doors that led out onto a stone terrace, the cool night air beckoning her. Liam watched her go, a mix of confusion and awe on his face. He then turned his attention fully to Marcus, who was still frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the tablecloth. Liam's expression hardened, his love for his sister transforming into a cold, protective fury. "Marcus," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "Get up." Marcus didn't respond. He seemed incapable of movement or speech. Liam's new father-in-law, a stoic and powerful man in his own right, had noticed the commotion and was now standing beside him. "What did you do to her?" Liam demanded, his voice shaking with restrained anger. "What did you say in that disgusting speech, and what did she just say to you?" Marcus finally looked up, his eyes hollow and pleading, as if begging for an escape that didn't exist. He shook his head, unable to articulate the depth of his own destruction. Liam didn't need an answer. The truth was written all over Marcus's face. "Get out," Liam said, the words sharp and final. "Get out of my wedding." Now, Marcus flinched as if struck. He looked around, seeing the curious and judgmental faces of the guests who were now openly staring. His public life, his reputation, his meticulously crafted image, it was all evaporating before his very eyes. Supported by his father-in-law, Liam made sure Marcus was escorted from the premises, a disgraced king being banished from the castle, leaving nothing behind but the ghost of his own arrogance. The rest of the evening unfolded like a dream for Alara. The departure of Marcus was a quiet affair, handled with swift and discreet efficiency by Liam's new family, who had closed ranks around her protectively. She stood on the terrace for a long time, breathing in the cool, jasmine-scented air, feeling the tension of the last decade seep out of her bones. When she returned to the reception hall, the atmosphere had shifted. The cloud of toxic humiliation had lifted, and in its place was a palpable warmth directed entirely at her. Chloe, her new sister-in-law, came to her side immediately, wrapping her in a fierce, loving hug. "I am so sorry, Alara," she whispered. "No one should ever be spoken to like that. We love you." There was no pity in her voice, only solidarity. Later, Liam pulled her onto the dance floor. As he spun her around to a slow, sweet melody, he looked at her with pride. "I don't know what you said to him," he murmured, "but I've never been prouder of you, Alara. You looked like a warrior. She just smiled, a real, full-hearted smile, and rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the simple, profound comfort of family. For the first time, she wasn't an accessory or an afterthought. She was the guest of honor at her own liberation party. The news of Marcus's infidelity and the impending scandal of a pregnant intern spread through their social and professional circles like wildfire in the weeks that followed. His carefully built empire, founded as much on his image as on his business acumen, began to crumble. Board members called for emergency meetings. Investors pulled out. The man who had preached about strength and control was revealed to be reckless and weak. His downfall was as swift as it was total. The divorce was uncontested. He gave her everything she asked for, not out of generosity, but out of a desperate, futile hope that she might keep the finer details of his disgrace private. She took it, not as a prize, but as reparations for the years of her life she had invested in his lies. She used the money to go back to school, to finish the architecture degree she had abandoned for him. She rediscovered her passion, her talent, her voice. She started her own small firm, designing homes that were filled with light and air, spaces built on principles of integrity and strength, everything her marriage had lacked. She was no longer Marcus Thorne's quiet, simple wife. She was Alara, an architect, a business owner, a sister, a woman who had found her way back to herself. So, let me ask you again. Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever been underestimated, your strength and intelligence dismissed by someone who believed they held all the power? Alara's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about knowing your own worth, even when others try to diminish it. It's about the quiet courage it takes to hold onto your truth, to gather your facts, and to wait for the right moment to speak it. For years, Alara endured disrespect in silence, believing it was the price of peace. But the peace was false, and her silence only empowered her tormentor. The moment she chose to reclaim her voice, she didn't need to scream or cause a scene. A single, well-placed whisper, armed with undeniable truth, was all it took to bring a tyrant to his knees and set herself free. Her story teaches us that our voices have power, no matter how quietly we choose to use them. It teaches us that dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It is something we own, and sometimes we have to fight to reclaim it. The world is full of people who will try to define you, to put you in a box, to make you smaller so that they can feel bigger. Do not let them. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Let them know that they are seen, that they are valued, and that their voice, no matter how quiet, has the power to change everything. Comment below with a time you found the courage to speak your truth, and let's create a chorus of voices that can no longer be ignored. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to simply and finally speak.